Something unprecedented is stirring in Washington as Republicans quietly challenge the authority of Donald Trump. For the first time in years, the rebellion isn't coming from outside protests or opposition politicians, but from within his own party. This internal pushback represents a fundamental test of American governance as lawmakers weigh loyalty against constitutional responsibility, considering whether unchecked presidential power can be tolerated. The confrontation arises from a series of alarming signals, emergency declarations, bold rhetoric, and policy maneuvers that suggest a willingness to act unilaterally. Senators are scrutinizing statements and proposals that historically would have been dismissed as political theater. But now they're realizing that the stakes are higher, as Trump's instinctual approach to authority may bypass legal, diplomatic, and institutional safeguards designed to prevent unilateral escalation. Republican lawmakers are moving cautiously, but deliberately, analyzing the implications of executive actions that could provoke conflict not only abroad but with allies like NATO nations. This unprecedented vigilance comes from an understanding that when a president views military options as transactional or property-like, global consequences may follow. Their efforts reflect not partisan opposition, but a measured concern for constitutional balance and the integrity of the system. Senatorial responses have evolved from polite questioning to concrete interventions, such as invoking the War Powers Act. The goal is clear: prevent a scenario in which presidential impulses override collective decision-making. For many Republicans, the act is no longer an abstract law, but a critical break, designed to curb unilateral authority in moments when instinct threatens to replace institutional procedure and diplomacy, preserving American credibility and security. Trump's reaction has been predictable: escalation rather than negotiation, dramatization instead of compromise. He frames any internal resistance as betrayal, deploying emergency declarations and rhetorical spectacle to reclaim the narrative. But Republican lawmakers perceive a dangerous pattern: power exercised as personal will, shielded by crisis language, risks undermining the very systems that sustain executive authority. Beyond the spectacle, the stakes are procedural. Oversight, promised disclosures, and accountability mechanisms have slowed or stalled, raising red flags. Senators are no longer merely observing; they are scrutinizing processes, deadlines, and compliance measures. This pressure exposes the tension between rapid, performative governance and slow, methodical institutional procedure, highlighting the limits of authority that rely on personality rather than established rules. The interplay of emergency powers, delayed disclosures, and unilateral decision-making has pushed Republican legislators into a delicate balancing act. They must defend the integrity of constitutional norms without appearing overtly partisan. Their decisions are guided by both principle and prudence, recognizing that failure to act now could normalize practices that compromise institutional authority, setting precedents with lasting consequences for future administrations. Trump's worldview complicates matters further. He treats geopolitics as leverage, assets, and negotiation rather than alliances or obligations. While this approach might succeed in business, it risks destabilizing global relationships and provoking crises that Congress must manage. Republicans are acutely aware that hesitation or silence could enable irreversible damage, transforming potential crises into systemic tests of constitutional resilience. The culmination of these tensions manifests in subtle yet consequential ways: private coordination, calculated votes, and behind-the-scenes pressure. Senators who once deferred to party discipline now measure the cost of silence against institutional preservation. Their actions reflect a growing recognition that safeguarding constitutional norms may require confronting the president directly, even if that means risking intra-party conflict and public scrutiny. At the heart of this revolt lies the simple yet terrifying realization: presidential power is not absolute, and even internal loyalty has limits. Republicans are weighing institutional preservation over individual allegiance, understanding that unchecked power, when wrapped in spectacle and grievance, threatens to erode the very rules that define American democracy. This cautious but resolute pushback marks a historical inflection point in contemporary governance. As Trump escalates, emergency narratives dominate the conversation, but Congress quietly asserts its authority. Lawmakers are scrutinizing every action, from oil asset declarations to foreign policy rhetoric, measuring legality and long-term implications. This internal resistance isn't about politics alone. It's about ensuring that institutional limits remain intact, preserving the balance of power regardless of who holds the presidency. Senators now confront the paradox of loyalty versus responsibility. Supporting Trump blindly risks institutional damage, while opposing him publicly could ignite party backlash. This tension creates a delicate environment where decisions are weighed not for optics or media attention, but for the long-term stability of governance structures and adherence to constitutional safeguards meant to prevent the concentration of unchecked power. Oversight mechanisms, like inspector general reviews, have become critical tools. Republicans understand that these processes, while slow and methodical, provide a counterweight to impulsive executive actions. Delays in promised disclosures, lapses in compliance, and stalled timelines are no longer minor administrative issues. They are indicators that unchecked authority may be undermining accountability, requiring measured but firm legislative intervention. The ongoing revolt has forced a recalibration of party dynamics. Senators who once deferred to executive prerogatives are now openly asserting independence. Their strategy emphasizes procedural rigor over partisan allegiance, reinforcing the notion that safeguarding constitutional norms is more important than loyalty to any individual. This quiet assertiveness represents a shift in Republican priorities, from temporary alignment to institutional preservation. Trump's approach to governance, emphasizing spectacle, emergency declarations, and unilateral decision-making, increasingly clashes with legislative processes. Republicans recognize that normalized emergency powers risk eroding precedents that define checks and balances. By acting deliberately, they aim to prevent a dangerous cycle where executive overreach becomes routine, ensuring that future leaders cannot bypass systemic safeguards without consequences. The tension extends to public perception. While media attention focuses on crisis narratives and political rhetoric, the real battle occurs behind the scenes. Republican senators coordinate votes, exchanges, and interventions to maintain procedural integrity. Their cautious but decisive actions underscore a crucial truth. Governance is sustained not by personalities or slogans, but by institutions capable of enforcing accountability when authority is tested. Emergency declarations, whether tied to foreign policy or domestic assets, are used by Trump to centralize narrative control. But Republicans interpret these moves as attempts to distract from stalled processes and oversight gaps. By addressing these procedural weaknesses, lawmakers aim to prevent normalization of executive overreach, preserving transparency and the rule of law, while signaling that institutional limits cannot be overridden for personal or political gain. The revolt's significance lies in its long-term consequences. Each vote, call, or procedural challenge is a deliberate signal that power must remain conditional, even for a president with extraordinary influence. Republican senators, acting with measured caution, understand that the stakes transcend the current administration, shaping the precedent for how future executives can exercise authority within constitutional boundaries. This cautious assertiveness is reflected in legislative maneuvering and internal coordination. Lawmakers are documenting concerns, consulting legal advisors, and tracking compliance to ensure that unilateral actions are met with measured pushback. The strategy prioritizes preservation over confrontation, aiming to sustain institutional credibility even amid political theatrics, underscoring the reality that procedural rigor ultimately safeguards democracy. At its core, the internal revolt highlights a central dilemma: loyalty to a leader versus loyalty to the system. Republicans now act from a recognition that unchecked power, while seemingly advantageous in the short term, risks long-term damage to institutional stability. Their efforts represent not defiance for political gain, but a measured attempt to enforce accountability and maintain the frameworks that uphold American governance beyond any single presidency. The revolt has exposed an uncomfortable truth. When a president treats power as personal property, institutional checks must step in decisively. Republican senators are realizing that delay or inaction risks normalizing extraordinary measures. By acting now, they reinforce the principle that the presidency, no matter who holds it, is subject to rules, oversight, and accountability. Behind closed doors, party discussions have shifted from strategy to survival. Senators and aides assess which actions preserve constitutional norms while minimizing political fallout. This internal calculus is painstaking, balancing the optics of opposition with the necessity of safeguarding institutions that ensure democracy functions even under the pressure of a highly personalized executive style. The War Powers Act has become a critical battlefield. By invoking its provisions, Congress asserts its right to limit unilateral military decisions, preventing escalation into conflict without oversight. Republican support for this measure reflects an understanding that power without checks is a threat not just to allies, but to the stability of the American system itself, demonstrating that principle now outweighs partisan loyalty. Each emergency declaration issued by the White House further underscores the stakes. While framed as protective or necessary, these actions are increasingly viewed as tools for narrative control. Republican lawmakers are responding with methodical interventions, ensuring that extraordinary claims do not become habitual shortcuts, signaling that constitutional limits are not suggestions, but enforceable obligations. Procedural pressure has intensified. Senators track document releases, oversight requests, and timelines with renewed urgency. Delays or mismanagement that once seemed minor are now treated as red flags requiring formal inquiry. This meticulous attention to process reflects a recognition that executive power is most dangerous when it operates in opacity, and that transparency is the foundation of democratic accountability. The internal revolt also reveals a shift in the understanding of loyalty. Where previously alignment with party leadership was sufficient, lawmakers now recognize that allegiance to the system is paramount. Protecting institutions against overreach is no longer optional, and Republican senators are quietly redefining their responsibilities in ways that prioritize governance over short-term political cohesion. The administration's insistence on spectacle amplifies scrutiny. Every public statement, threat, or declaration prompts lawmakers to measure legality, risk, and precedent. Republicans are methodically responding, not with theatrics, but with formal votes, inquiries, and coordination behind the scenes, demonstrating that process, not personality, is the ultimate arbiter of authority in a system designed to resist abuse. Oversight and accountability are not partisan tools in this context, they are structural safeguards. By acting together, Republican senators signal that extraordinary presidential actions must remain within legal bounds. This approach is deliberate and calculated, aiming to prevent a dangerous precedent where the executive branch defines its own limits, ensuring that constitutional frameworks remain operative regardless of political pressures. The stakes are magnified by public perception. While media narratives focus on conflict and crisis, legislators are quietly reinforcing procedures that ensure long-term institutional health. Their actions demonstrate a clear message: accountability cannot be bypassed through spectacle, and temporary advantages gained through emergency powers cannot outweigh the enduring stability of governance structures. Ultimately, the revolt illustrates a broader lesson about democracy. Power is conditional, and survival depends on systems, not personalities. Republican senators are navigating a delicate balance, defending institutional norms while managing political risks. Their cautious, procedural approach emphasizes that safeguarding the foundations of governance is essential, even in moments dominated by high-stakes spectacle and executive assertiveness. As the internal revolt continues, Republican lawmakers are recognizing the long-term consequences of unchecked authority. They understand that short-term political gains cannot justify compromising institutional integrity. Every vote, phone call, and resolution is being weighed for its impact on the system itself, reinforcing the idea that governance is bigger than any individual, even a sitting president. Emergency rhetoric has become a double-edged sword. While designed to project strength, it also exposes vulnerabilities. Senators see that repeated appeals to crisis erode public trust and strain the limits of constitutional authority. The response is methodical, ensuring that what may appear as spectacle on the surface is countered by deliberate, procedural reinforcement of democratic norms behind closed doors. Documentation and disclosure delays are no longer tolerated as routine bureaucracy. Republicans, alongside Democrats, scrutinize each timeline memo and report to ensure compliance with the law. By elevating procedural integrity over political expediency, they create an environment where the executive cannot act purely on instinct or whim, signaling that accountability remains enforceable and non-negotiable. Coordination between senators is subtle but deliberate. Meetings, private calls, and strategy discussions focus not on public messaging, but on preserving institutional function. Every line drawn, every vote cast, and every oversight request serves a broader goal: maintaining a separation of powers that prevents unilateral decision-making, ensuring that the presidency operates within established limits rather than above them. Public attention is a factor, but not the driver. While media coverage amplifies spectacle, Republican lawmakers act with foresight, prioritizing structural consequences over narrative battles. This shift reflects a growing consensus that institutional preservation is a responsibility that supersedes personal loyalty or political branding, reinforcing that democracy functions through procedure, not personality. The pattern of escalation by the executive branch underscores the importance of restraint. With each declared emergency and provocative statement, lawmakers document, verify, and respond within the bounds of legality. This meticulous attention signals that procedural checks are active, deliberate, and unyielding, maintaining the integrity of the system even under pressure from extraordinary presidential action. Oversight becomes increasingly formalized. Requests for inspector general reviews, congressional hearings, and detailed compliance assessments illustrate that the internal revolt is strategic, not reactive. Republican lawmakers are deliberately ensuring that all actions have documentation and precedent, creating a durable foundation that protects institutional authority against unilateral power grabs, regardless of political optics. Party unity is being recalibrated around principle, not expedience. Republicans recognize that silence or passive alignment can inadvertently normalize extraordinary executive behavior. By asserting independence, enforcing checks, and coordinating responses, they signal that loyalty to the country and the Constitution takes precedence over loyalty to a single leader, reinforcing the idea that governance requires accountability above all. The tension between spectacle and substance defines this period. Every public declaration of crisis, emergency, or threat is met with structured procedural responses. Republican senators carefully separate narrative from law, understanding that personal theatrics cannot override constitutional obligations. This disciplined approach preserves the framework of governance, ensuring the system remains resilient even in moments of intense political pressure. Ultimately, the internal revolt highlights a crucial lesson. Democracy is maintained through vigilance, procedure, and accountability, not through charisma or dominance. Republican lawmakers, by methodically exercising oversight, voting strategically, and enforcing compliance, demonstrate that safeguarding institutions is essential. Their actions confirm that enduring governance relies on systems, not personalities, and that rules, once respected, transcend any temporary power. The crescendo of internal resistance now collides with public perception. Senators understand that unchecked executive spectacle can mislead voters and erode trust in institutions. By maintaining procedural rigor behind the scenes, they counterbalance public theatrics with deliberate, lawful action, showing that governance depends on facts, records, and precedent rather than hype or threats. Every legislative maneuver reflects a deeper strategy, preserving separation of powers. Republicans carefully navigate votes, resolutions, and inquiries not for headlines, but to ensure that no branch of government becomes subordinate to personal will. Their coordination signals that institutional resilience is prioritized above temporary political victories or public applause. The emergency declarations, while dramatic, are now parsed and scrutinized for legality. Republican lawmakers understand that precedent matters and that extraordinary measures must not normalize executive overreach. By challenging unilateral action and enforcing statutory limits, they emphasize that even a president's intentions are constrained by law, preserving accountability at the highest level. Public messaging contrasts sharply with internal discipline. While rhetoric escalates outside Capitol walls, behind closed doors, lawmakers act with caution and precision. Every conversation, document request, and vote reflects careful consideration of long-term consequences, reinforcing the idea that procedural integrity is the cornerstone of sustainable governance, irrespective of transient political advantage. The unfolding dynamics underscore a fundamental tension between authority and accountability. Republican senators recognize that unchecked unilateral action can destabilize institutions. By methodically asserting oversight, coordinating internally, and weighing constitutional obligations, they demonstrate that safeguarding democracy requires active engagement and measured resistance, not mere rhetoric or passive support. Oversight and procedural enforcement now dominate internal strategy. Lawmakers emphasize record-keeping, statutory compliance, and formal review processes to ensure the executive cannot bypass constraints. Every memo, timeline, and resolution becomes part of a broader protective framework, reinforcing that democratic governance depends on structure, not on individual loyalty or charisma. The internal revolt also serves as a public signal, though subtly. Republican actions, carefully calculated and often confidential, demonstrate that institutional rules remain operative. By resisting extraordinary measures, lawmakers reaffirm that constitutional limits exist for all leaders, regardless of popularity, legacy ambitions, or political theater, ensuring governance is preserved above spectacle. Strategic patience is evident in every move. Republican lawmakers avoid impulsive confrontation, instead relying on procedural weight and legal precedent. Their quiet coordination strengthens institutional checks, ensuring that every vote, resolution, or inquiry contributes to reinforcing the system's resilience against overreach, maintaining the delicate balance of powers that underpins American democracy. The crescendo of tension illustrates a vital lesson. Oversight is both protective and preventive. By carefully enforcing limits on executive power, Republican senators prevent crises from escalating beyond control. Their insistence on legality, documentation, and constitutional adherence reflects a commitment to governance that transcends personalities, demonstrating that institutions can endure even under extraordinary pressure. In conclusion, this moment represents a defining test for American democracy. Internal revolt, oversight, emergency scrutiny, and procedural enforcement converge to illustrate that governance depends on more than public spectacle or personal authority. Republican lawmakers, through deliberate, measured, and principled action, ensure that institutional integrity persists, proving that democracy survives only when systems remain stronger than those who temporarily occupy power.